Okay, well, hi, everyone. Jessica Brillhart. Thank you, Roberto, and thanks for everyone, and Elliot, and for folks for having me here. I wanted to start with this heavy question. And it's the thing that I've been chasing for the past few years now. And it's a question I'm constantly asking myself. And it's a tad intimidating because I don't feel I really have the answer for this yet. And any glimpse of one has come more from a feeling out of what VR actually wanted from me. And I've been using my experience as a filmmaker to identify these tension points in VR. And I've found is actually where VR pushes back, where things as a filmmaker don't work, is where it speaks to us the loudest. And it gets us closer to understanding what VR is all about. And if nothing else, it reinforces why we creators do what we do in the first place. It's like, well, why do we edit? Why do we have actors? And why do we film a particular scene a particular way? And I first want to talk about a fundamental shift in language. This is a frame. For filmmakers, this is our everything, right? We scrutinize it, we obsess over it. This is the whole point of our medium. But a frame doesn't mean jack when you can do this. The frame is instead autonomous, reactive, and very much alive. And that's because what's determining the frame isn't a camera, but it's a person who controls herself. And she's a flesh and blood human with her own thoughts, memories, and experiences. And she's autonomous and reactive and very much alive. So the frame is not ours to control anymore. It's completely dependent on someone's engagement in an experience. But does that mean we lose the frame completely? And no, not at all. What this ultimately means, if you can understand the potential engagement in an experience, the closer you can get to understanding where frames might be. And in order to appropriately evaluate that, you'll need a much better representation of what's actually happening than what you're seeing on the screen right now. And unfortunately, the way that stitches are done, basically when you film in live action, you get these stitches back. We see them like frames. And it's wrong, because really we're not seeing all of this at once. We're seeing very specific parts of it. And anything can be a frame. The better way of seeing it, and the way that I like to see it, is more like this. It's a world. So when we film a scene in VR, we end up creating a micro world of sorts, with its own flow, its own function, occupied by elements, people, places, sounds, music, all which have a potential to connect and affect anyone who ends up there. Another shift, which I think is important to note, is, like in film, we've referred to our audience as viewers. And that made a lot of sense. Because, when we would be watching a film, we would be sitting out there and you would see a frame up there and you couldn't go into the frame. You would be ridiculous seen doing that or trying to do that. But VR, on the other hand, is allowing you onto that place. What happens is you become part of it. So, if someone asks you, what did you do on vacation? You say, well, I viewed Jamaica. It's like, okay, that's weird. But what you say is, I visited Jamaica. I went there. I was an active participant. I visited. And that's what we should be calling these people that come to our experiences, really the visitor. So frames to worlds and viewer to visitor. And that completely changes how we see the craft in this space. Because the great VR, the stuff that really resonates, is when the world and the visitor connect. Any great experience we've ever had involves that, right? So I'm going to go into a little craft one-on-one. And there's a lot to do once you start thinking about how we engage with spaces and how those spaces respond to us. And one of the coolest bits, the stuff that I'm really excited about and dear to me, is editing. For me, figuring out a way to edit in the space revealed a great deal more about how to craft for this stuff from the ground up. So traditional editing is a frame-to-frame construct. Now, it gets heavier and more nuanced, but generally we're speaking about it like this. And in VR, because frames are reactive and they're tied to visitors' behavior, this visual, again, doesn't work. We can't premeditate frames in our own head and say, well, that's what that person's going to see at all times. And it's not true. The best way to see it isn't this, but it's actually this. Back to worlds. It's world to world to world. And what we're really doing is creating these universes that we pull someone through. And there are ways that we can manage this. There's ways that we can handle it. The first is identifying points of interest, or I call these POIs, and I think a lot of folks do. These are places on the world where a visitor's attention will most likely land. And if we can predict where a visitor's attention will most likely go on a world, then we can match that attention with something else in the following world that engages with that attention spot, responds to it, rejects it, or simply presents something else entirely, but maybe something that's actually important to the story. So you see here, and then next world, there's something there. So here's an example. It's a film I made called Go Habs Go about the opening night of the Montreal Canadiens ice hockey season. In this particular scene, ice hockey players are moving to the center of the ice, handing a torch to each other, with everyone watching them do it. And although I can never be 100% sure of what anyone's looking at, I can make a pretty strong bet that a visitor would pay attention most to the thing that's on fire in the middle of the ice. So here's what I do. Give it a second.
Matin, la nuit, non seulement pour leur carrière, mais quel que soit le sujet, de ne pas avoir peur de me contacter. Une fois qu'on devient membre de cette grande équipe, on songe effectivement. Avoir été si près à nos 2 premières années.
Now, if I would have actually done this the way that some people tend to want to do it, you would go from the point of interest of where someone's looking to maybe the ice rink, right? Because everyone just wants to watch the game. But then you would totally have missed that guy. And he's the most important part of that whole scene. He's probably the best part of the whole movie, to be honest. And so what's interesting, too, is that what you find is that it actually shifts as well. So you may start with him, but as soon as he stops looking at you, he starts looking at the rink. So you get the rink anyway. But now you have a sense of space, you have a sense of coordination, you have a sense of movement on the world that you've made. So by identifying points of interest and responding to these areas of attention, I've kind of created a sense of coherence. It's like unlocking an intricate cipher, and suddenly you have a pathway. But it doesn't always work out so perfectly. So first, let's think about POIs in the real world. Take a look at this scene and identify where a POI or a point of interest might be. No, I can't be 100% certain, but I'm pretty sure you probably picked that mountain climber, right? He's the only human on the world. He's the only one moving. He's moving away from us. He's the only person making a sound in the scene, which I know you can't hear, but, imagine. So, you made a good bet. Good job. Now let's try this one. Identify the points of interest in this scene. Now, I bet that you and the person next to you have different answers. I also bet that you're questioning yourself on this and your decisions, and you're drifting your attention to other potential POIs. There are many people on the tram, but notice how none of them are looking at you. They're looking at the windows at the scenery around them. Though I may initially look at the people on the tram in the beginning, market research has also showed that after a while, you start to engage with what that person is looking at. So after a moment, you would start to drift from those people to what they're looking at instead of me, which are the windows. Now, experience can be messy, and our attention shifts and changes over time, but we can play with that, and here's how. So let's take the windows as POIs in this case. When you're in VR, you don't look at a window, you look through a window and pass it at what's beyond the window. The visitor is engaging with depth. So in this case, I toy with extending and responding to that engagement, and this is how it works. When on the tram, if you're looking through the front or back windows, I decide to extend that with the horse stable following it. Same kind of engagement. You're looking down the hallway of a horse stable. You're looking past through a window at what's going on in front of you. And that's extending that engagement. I'm not saying anything about it. I'm not creating a conversation. I'm just pulling you through it. Now, the emotions one feel when your engagement is responded to is very different. This is what happens when you look through the left or the right windows. So you're greeted with a horse face. And the second thing to think about, and I think it's important, just in general with anything, is rebellion. Sometimes people just won't look in the direction that you think they're going to look at all. And there's no explanation. It could be like, oh, there's actually something else there, or oh, I don't really like this thing I'm seeing in front of me, or I they saw a bug and they think bugs are cool and now they're over there. So as a creator, we can really leverage that by creating something back there. So in the scene from Residence that I did, there's a young girl, Kennedy, playing violin, and that's it. If you get that, great, awesome. But what if you turn away from her? You see her parents watching through the doorway. Now you still hear Kennedy. You still get the point, but I would argue this is much more cinematic because you're seeing the parents, you're seeing their response, and you're hearing Kennedy behind you. And it ends up being a much more enriching experience. Okay, now final task here. Sometimes life can be downright tricky to pin down. So new game, find the POIs in this. I'll give you a little bit more time. It's hard. It's not easy. It's chaos or null or, however you prefer to call it, but that's not necessarily a bad thing. There are situations, especially in VR, especially in editing, where null and chaos are great. Consider the fact that most people have never done VR, right? Like, some of you have, but like if you look at the vast majority of people, they have not. They've waited in a long line, they've spent a long time waiting for something to download, they just bought the thing, they don't know how it works, someone just shoved a cave on their face, I don't know. And so basically they're in this situation where they're like, okay, I've been wanting to do this or I don't know what this is, and there's a huge amount of anxiety in that. Films have this thing where you walk into a building, you order popcorn, you're ordering soda, you watch the trailers, you do some trivia, you may play some video games, you sit down, the lights go out, you watch some previews, and then the film starts. They don't just shove you in a room and start the film. There's a cadence. So in VR, we can do the same thing. So what I actually use the rocks for in this case is to let people just chill out. It's not expecting anything from you. It's literally just rocks. You're just hanging out with rocks. And it's great because then I can orient them in the next world and show them that you can turn around. And the fact that you can actually engage with someone to get them to calm and then give them an idea of what their toolkit is, what they're actually capable of doing in a space is actually very important. Because otherwise people just stand there, because that's what we do. Worlds also have energy. So this is a scene from Google I/O in 2015. And the feeling is less than comfortable. Like, that guy doesn't have time for you. He's going to check his watch, And it feels like you're a piece of technology or plastic because you are. You're the rig. Like, in every situation, you are a rig. You're a camera that people respond to. And these people don't really know what to think of you. Now, compare that to the feeling you get from something like this. This is the first stitch I ever saw, and you feel great because those engineers built you, and they're happy that you work. That's a totally different shift. I mean, they're walking around, they're throwing things, they're smiling, they're laughing. I mean, it's a real feeling. And when I saw this, that's when I was like, this is something really special. Because this is a very hard thing to replicate in film. You have to actually be there to feel that energy. We piece together this energy and this aura. And it impacts the entirety of the experience. And it's not all virtual. We have bodies. We still have bodies. And we still got to move. So something to think about, too, is how much are people actually moving? It's like a dance, no matter how you cut it, right? So thinking about how much does someone move, what's that dance look like? And you put that all together, and this is what you get. This is World Tour. This is the first film ever made in VR. I will never make another one of these because it will drive me absolutely insane. But this is for you, and this is what it is. And think of it like this. I used to go to the Baltimore Aquarium all the time as a kid. I love that aquarium. It is the best aquarium in the world, and I'm not just saying it because I'm here. It is. I said that to other museums, and they've also agreed. So but if you go there, think about it. Like it's brilliant. You go in and there's like bubbles, and then the bubbles become a large pool filled with like that one-finned turtle and the stingrays, and then you go up 5 floors and you get to the rainforest, like you're breaching the water, and then you spiral down. It's wonderful. It's wonderful. Go there. When next time you go there, preferably not when all the kids are there, but go there and like experience it. It's great. It's really profound stuff. So World Tour was the first experience I made, which is really about this idea of how do I bring together all these different locations. I went to Japan and Iceland and went to Arecibo, and I didn't know what I was doing, but I'm like, I got to put it all together. How do I do that? Resonance, which is where the Kennedy clip is from. You follow a violinist, and I use the violinist to unlock doors and stairs and different characters and different moments in the scene, kind of like a Pied Piper-y type thing. And then I break it apart and see how surreal I can make it. Can music be represented differently? Go Habs Go was a documentary. The closest thing to ice skating I did was with an apple crate on a pond and like pushing myself. So I had to film the opening game for an ice hockey team. And it was really about creating like what's a traditional documentary in this space? How can I make it work? And then stuff got kind of weird. And I'm going to go into how these pieces sort of came to be. And that's really the craft 102. And here's some of that weird stuff. We see and hear a very small amount of what exists in the universe. We just do. It's how we evolved. It's how we came to be. That's just it. So I wanted to play with that. What don't we perceive, really? Are there other systems that can help us perceive things in ways that we haven't perceived them before? And so I worked with a team at Google when I was there called the Artist and Machine Intelligence Team. And what they did was work with me on bringing something called Deep Dream into VR. I'm not an engineer, but I am going to give you a very maybe like layman's way of describing it. It's basically if you know that enhance thing when they do on TV, they're like enhance, and then they make the scene somehow gets bigger and everything's really crisp and clear. So they were trying to actually do that. They were thinking about ways they could actually do that. But then they reversed it just for fun, and it started to dream up things on top of these pixels it was evaluating. So you got like these weird banana puppy slugs, and you started getting these weird like vegetation stuff that started growing. It was a very trippy thing. So of course I'm like, well, put it in VR and see what happens. And so we did. And so I took some of the stuff that I had filmed and we mapped, we dreamt on top of it. Like I wouldn't have seen eyes in the sky or puppy slugs on the ground but it was pretty incredible. And this was with like, I mean, there's actually a film here called Alteration that uses a similar technology and brings it into the piece. This is what we did like 2 years ago. So this was like the peanut butter method. Like, let's just see what happens. Like snakes in Arecibo. It's insane. So, these are things that I would not have been able to imagine myself. But using, a neural net and, and art that comes from it, I could actually use that and leverage that to create something unique. It's not so much like letting it do everything, by the way. There's some tension between like, what parameters do I want to do and what does it want to do and what can we create as a result of that? So I worked on that. And then came this piece that I really want to talk about. It's here. It's called Beethoven's Fifth. And I made it because, something really important to me was we don't hear and see the same way between each other. Like, I don't see red the same way as Gabo sees red, or Elliot sees red. I don't hear Beethoven's Fifth the same way as Gabo or Elliot. And some of us can't hear at all. So what's Beethoven's Fifth to someone who's deaf? And I have been talking with NASA and NASA JPL about reimagining the Golden Record in VR. And the Golden Record is a message from Earth mounted on 2 probes, Voyager 1 and Voyager 2, that are destined for interstellar space. Voyager 1 is there. Voyager 2 is going to be there soon-ish. We don't know really when. And on the record is a curated list of content. These are images, greetings, sounds, and music. It was meant to show the breadth of experience of us humans on Earth. And one of the songs that was on it was a recording of Beethoven's Fifth, and it was performed by the Philharmonia Orchestra in the 1950s. So I was like, been talking to the Philharmonia Orchestra, so let's try to do something in VR there. So I filmed a performance of Beethoven's Fifth by today's Philharmonia Orchestra, and you're in the middle, and I can use music to, motivate the edit. I think the audio's off. So, yeah. So, yay, great. But I couldn't stay there. Like, I couldn't have that be enough. I'm like, well, okay, what is music, though? What is hearing? And I had those questions because Ann Jurian, who's the creative director on the record, went back in the 70s, asked the question, what could I do for Beethoven? Why put Beethoven on the record? What was the story for her with that? So 40 years later, I wanted to ask the same thing. What could I do for Beethoven? Beethoven was going deaf at the time of writing Beethoven's Fifth, so I wanted this to be just as much about him and his struggle as the music itself. So I did some research. There's a book by Oliver Sacks called Seeing Voices, and in it he speaks about a test that was conducted with a group of deaf Chinese students and a group of students of normal sight and hearing. And both groups were shown Chinese characters in the dark with a laser pointer. The results were remarkable. The deaf students were able to recall in precise detail the characters drawn in the dark, much better than the students who could both see and hear. Like, considerably better. And they determined that when one lost her ability to hear, the other perceptual abilities compensated. So the brain reshaped itself. The result in the case of deafness is something that looks a lot like, long exposure photography. Sachs calls it movement parsing, and it's why something like sign language is so effective. So I put movement parsing in the piece. Another thing I noticed, and it's not research that I recommend, because unless you have a lot of Tylenol, is tinnitus. I was really thinking about, okay, how do I actually, beyond integrating it into this piece beautifully, what else could I do? And I was listening to the sounds of interstellar space, like you do, and tinnitus and sounds oddly similar, and you can raise it up too, to the sounds of interstellar space. This is not sonified data. This is actually how interstellar space sounds. There's an instrument on Voyager 1 that actually, that's its only job, is to figure that out. Now, thinking about, disability as not necessarily being a disability, but perhaps a connective force between something that is out there. I mean, it's a bit out there in thinking that, but I was like, what if Beethoven had some sort of connection to something far beyond our comprehension, far beyond our solar system? Maybe? So I have that in the piece as well. Another piece that another aspect of this is Helen Keller, who was both deaf and blind, and she put a hand to a radio during a broadcast of Beethoven's Ninth. This one was Beethoven's Ninth. And she could tell the difference between the woodwinds and the brass, the singing and violins, just by feeling the vibrations. And it had seemed that Beethoven, who was stricken by his own deafness, had inadvertently or perhaps purposely been a composer of music for the deaf. And something she said that I think is really beautiful, Helen Keller said, "As I listened with darkness and melody, shadow and sound filling all the room, I could not help remembering that the great composer who poured forth such a flood of sweetness into the world was deaf like myself. I marveled at the power of his quenchless spirit by which out of his pain he wrought such joy for others. And there I sat, feeling with my hand the magnificent symphony which broke like a sea upon the silent shores of his soul and mine." So I had haptics. What ended up happening, and we premiered this at Sheffield Doc Fest, is that I had a considerable amount of people coming through who were deaf. We don't see or hear the same way. There's a lot of potential for VR to help bridge that. And we talk a lot about engagement, as being like, how do I get them to see something? How do I get them interested or attached? Disengagement is just as important. Think about a room. Think about this room. Maybe occasionally you're not paying attention to me, which is fine. But sometimes we listen like this, and sometimes we have our headphones in and we listen in here. And there's a tension between how much we relate spatially to a space. And so, putting on my film hat for a moment, we kept referencing this famous scene from 2001: Space Odyssey, where there's an ape and it throws a bone into the air. And the most amazing match cut of all time is that. And we kept saying that moment, when you throw the bone up and then suddenly. So I wanted to create this in VR. I was like, yeah, let's give it a shot, And so, audio being so important, I talk about the visual, but audio is important. And we have these two ways that we do. I mean, there's multiple ways. One is recording the room, like the spatialized, feeling like you're there, ambisonic, like when you turn, things are here, things are there. And then there's internal, mono, right? What you hear inside your head, like a voiceover. or a piece of music that contextualizes the space. And you can generally have both things going, or you can have one versus another. And it turns out that playing with that tension, playing with engagement and disengagement, makes you feel a sort of breathlessness. And there's a little bit of what it's like if you, it feels like if you do this right, you can actually toss someone in the air and have them land. And then toss someone again and have them land. And it's sort of what Gabo was talking about with this idea of seeping out and then seeping back in, like waves on the shore. This isn't going to do it justice, you should just experience it, but here's a taste of it, and you can crank it. This is spatial. No. Bone being tossed, right? And cut. To space. It's a bit of a spoiler alert because I wasn't really sure if space is in it, but space is in it. So, you know, this is more to say that I think what really got to me was that worlds aren't set in stone. They decay, they evolve, they ebb, they flow. And there are a lot of layers. There are a lot of things going on. And we can leverage those layers to create narratives that help connect us to one another in a profound way that goes far deeper than what we see on the surface. And we should dig deep, because that's where all the good stuff is. Crazy stuff, but good stuff. So I want to end with a personal story. I grew up in York County, which is about a 30-minute drive north. And I knew about independent film because my friends and I would drive to Baltimore to the Senator or to the independent theater close by and watch Donnie Darko or Dangerous Lives of Altar Boys. And I didn't have a lot. Like, my dad was a huge nerd, so I did have a computer, and I was able to grow up with technology, which was very unique for someone in my community. This isn't York, by the way. This is a scene from something I shot in Bluff, Utah. This is the Utah Navajo State Fair. And I love this scene because I saw this all the time at the York Fairgrounds where rides just wouldn't work. And this was the reality. And it's not an awful reality, right? It's not like I hated that. It was just fun. It was just what my childhood was. And it might be unfortunate in ways, but I loved where I grew up. And I'm very proud of where I'm from. Does anyone know what this is? I don't know. It took me a bit too, but this is a Borders bookstore. They're gone now, I think. A lot of them are. This is a photo shot from the one that I used to go to all the time. This is the one that's in York, which is definitely not there anymore. And this is the last, like some of the last photos that are left from that space. I would drive to Borders. This is before the internet was a thing. And I would buy the cheapest drink I could get, which was like a tea, you know. And I grabbed a book on Final Cut 3, and I learned how to edit by reading a book in the cafe. I swear to God, I have notes that I'm like, I can't do this, but I literally, like, that's how I learned. My dad managed to get Final Cut 3. I'm not sure how. I don't ask questions, just, okay. And I made some stuff, like really silly stuff. And I used whatever I had, and it was one of the most creative times of my life. And I'm here today, right here, right now, because I did that. Thank you, Borders. R.I.P. VR is hard. I'm not going to pretend that it's easy. It is not. It drives you insane. And it can get expensive, and it is time-consuming, and it is complex. And I was particularly frustrated one day, so I gave myself a challenge, something Kid Jess would have really approved of. I told myself, I have a day. I'm only going to use stuff I could get off the internet. I thought back to being a kid. I went back to the 90s, sitting in the living room of our house and watching TV. And this is the result. You can crank it for sure. It's 4 panels of the Weather Channel that I got from YouTube, and a track from Weather Channel favorite and maestro of the soprano sax, Mr. Kenny G. Apparently a lot of folks in Omaha, Nebraska loved recording the Weather Channel, so each panel is weather from Omaha at different points in the 90s, and I appropriately named the piece Conditions at Omaha. And I wasn't expecting a lot in terms of response because it's silly. It's my how fast do burgers age piece. But the response came, and it was kind of amazing. Like The Verge, Mashable, you know, the Weather Channel, it to Kenny G is the least necessary VR experience, and we love it, and we love it. And Kenny G tweeted it. Yeah. He also makes saxophone and sex puns, like he switches the two. So this is actually hard. This is like he thought about this. I spy someone saxy playing smooth jazz in VR. And it didn't matter how someone else experienced it. Like, you know, some people looked at the weather, but some laid on the ground and simply looked up to watch Kenny G's GIF playing on repeat. Now, 2 weeks after I released it, AccuWeather released their Samsung Gear weather app. Now, I'm not saying this had anything to do with me, but it's a little bit of a coincidence. And the response wasn't so great. So the literal thing isn't necessarily the right thing. We remember things differently in fragments that grow and change over time. Everything we see is compressed experiential history. This mic, that chair, this computer. It's literally representative of all the experiences that came before. If that blows your mind, good. It should, and that feeling, that questioning is what's so powerful about this medium. It results in some things we could never predict or even begin to imagine. And it doesn't really take that much to get there. So what does VR want from me and you and all of us here? It's really this. To what the medium can do that no other medium can, but most importantly to yourself and the experiences that have resonated with you the most. So, thank you.
Observation and then a question. First of all, you know how you said in the movies there's this little build-up, you just don't go in? I need a build-up because you blew my mind. So we need a little build-up to the virtual reality. And some disengagement time from the virtual reality because that was like, ah! You scared me with the scene of space. I get it now.
Yeah.
But there's this thing where you're like, oh, I'm inside of it, and I'm looking around, and I was scared. So thank you for that.
Sure.
The question about point of view, though, do you sometimes lead people somewhere? Because at one point I looked at the back of the room and it was all white. Did you do that on purpose, or was that me doing it? Was that you doing it to get your hands back around someplace else that you wanted me to do?
Well, you know, I don't know if I should answer that question. I mean, I think something to you know, I kind of think of it, and I didn't go into this because I don't have a lot of time, but one, if you think about, I'm going to fight these people. Point of interest. I'm like, sorry, what? It's totally right. I think that you know, like I think like a one point of interest situation is a lot like a close-up, right? So like if you need a close-up, if you need that sort of feeling of someone being engaged in a space, it's like mise en scène, right? It's like crafting a whole. Get careful, my hands. It's like, you know, can you block certain things out? Can you motivate engagement forward? I'm not a fan of like the blinking arrow, like look here, like I'm dancing, like, you know, whatever. I think there's a lot of really interesting craft. Think about video games, right? I mean, no one's there saying, now go forward, now go left, now go right. What you're doing is, they do something called the squint test, where if you squint, you can kind of see where the pathway is. So crafting a space is also similar to that. It's like architecture, again, like a museum or an aquarium, where it's really just about what is this scene supposed to do for someone? Is it to represent a very particular thing, a very specific thing? And then just to know that doing that all the time kind of means that maybe you should be making a film and not a VR experience. But I think that, again, ebb and flow, like 2 or more points of interest can be a medium shot. No, you know, chaos rocks can be a wide shot. They all accomplish very similar things. So it's really about what you're trying to communicate in that particular scene, for sure.
Yeah, so I'm wondering if this VR experience and what you were talking about with the different points of interest and like that, you don't have one clear linear narrative, but it's just like kind of infinite.
Yeah.
If it's aesthetically trying to go further, you know, the kind of choral movies where you have all these different stories and they are weaved together, but at the same time, it's still in a very traditional way to do it. And so I'm kind of wondering if that would be the aesthetic, you know, through the media, trying to achieve that, of having, especially the piece you were showing with the ring and then the guy and then going to the ring, so you are really able to be all these different situations.
Yeah, I mean, if you think about the different narrative layers you want to include in it, so something like, say, interactivity could be a narrative layer. I can show you something, well, I actually don't have it, but do I? I don't. Give me a second, let me see if I can pull it up. But I'm not a fan of the choose your own adventure thing because I feel like Zork did a much better job in the 70s, so I don't really know why we would go backwards and make just stupid stuff. Let me see here. So like this I don't really like, yay, like what? But this is Zork back in 1970. This is the Great Underground Empire. That's Zork. That's like a video game in the 70s, like a text-based game where there was no actual visual, it was literally just text. And so if you go back to the original video, like I just made some changes. Like this is like, does time have no meaning in a secret place you can get to? Can you actually get to level 3 through level 1? Is the point to win at level 2? Is there like an infinite universe that branches out? Is it easy to hard or hard to easy, or sometimes it's easy and sometimes it's hard? Like, this is this, like, to kind of what Gabby was saying, it's like, these are the internal monologues we have with each other, with ourselves, too. Like, how that stuff changes over time and what you actually encounter when you do these things could link to the story. Now, it doesn't mean that if the objective is to get to 2 and you get there through going from 1 to 3 to 4 to 2, it's fine. You know, like, you can you create the parameters, you create the kind of the shell of the thing, and then within that, have the stuff that could create story for that person, that could entice story. And they won't be the same story, no matter how you cut it. But as long as the truth is there, as long as the truth of the experience is there, let the stories be what they are, because they'll all carry that one special thing.
Last question.
What's your camera choice and which editing software do you use?
If you asked me 3 months ago, I'd say Google Jump, because I would have to. No, it's my baby, actually, because I developed Jump at Google with engineers. So the reason that Odyssey exists is because I yelled a lot at GoPro and had very long conversations with engineers about workflow and stuff like that. So I still think it's one of the best ones out there. There's a new one called the Yi Halo, which is based on the same kind of stuff. They all have their ups and downs, to be honest. Like, you just kind of have to think about, like, do I need a top cam? Is up important? Do I want mono or stereo? And price range, too. You can get a Samsung Gear-like camera thing that's like, it's mono, but you can put it anywhere, and you can get it on Amazon. The haptic backpack that I brought is actually something you can buy on Amazon for like $300, which is still kind of expensive, but you can do it. So the price point of cameras will go down and so on, but it's really dependent upon the budget and what you're trying to achieve. From a post-production standpoint, very proud of that. When Adobe saw some of that stuff I was talking about, they were like, oh, so we should probably do something. I'm like, yeah, probably. Because before then, it was literally like seeing it flat and then like exporting it and seeing it, and then exporting it and seeing it, which it still kind of is. But now at least you can see there's like a viewport aware thing in Premiere where you can see kind of your point of interest and then see if the following scene actually matches with that. So you don't have to guess, you can just do it. And that stuff's just gonna get better. Apple might do something, but no one knows. But Premiere for now, out of the box, works great.
Okay, thank you, Jessica.
Yeah.